With that, let me welcome you all to this first session of a colloquium that we have designed to run over the next 3 months, rather January, February, March, on the very hot issue of competitiveness as to how does it sort of help us, how is it sort of preventing our growth in the sense that is desirable. And this issue has often come up in the recent past, even at our own webinars when we were discussing, for example, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that our industry is not so competitive. And therefore, they are scared, they are shy of entering into, of government of India entering into trade agreements which may disadvantage them. Now, this is an issue which has been talking for long, which people have been speaking about for long, and we hope that we will be able to come out with a white paper at the end of this 3 month sessions colloquium, which can then help the policymakers to steer a way, including industry chambers, to see how we can take forward the same in India. What we do expect from this colloquium is not the usual sort of comments and opinions which have been expressed in writing. We can get that all the while, but to see as to what kind of implementation issues which are desirable. This is something which has been addressed by Pritam Banerjee in his paper, which has been circulated to all, and he'll also speak about it for a little while shortly. And this goes on to the other catalytical speaker of this session is Amit Kapoor, who too has, being a chela, or as it were, a disciple of Michael Porter, or a close colleague, he'll come up with certain very good ideas. Now, we have been planning India in order to grow up, in order to provide jobs to the millions of youths which are coming into the job market, that India needs to grow at 9% for consistently for at least a decade, or at least 2 decades before we're able to reach that level. And we recently, the government of India, including the Prime Minister, has been speaking about a $5 trillion economy by 2025, which is just around the corner. Unfortunately, this target has become a little difficult because at the time when this target was adopted, we did not have COVID-19. Now, COVID-19 has shaken up not only the Indian economy, but the whole global economy. So there we have to see as to how we can steer our way in a way that we have a resilient economy and we are able to grow consistently. Now, one of the important factors of growth which has been seen with very clear evidence is the fact that export sector contribution is 7.5% of that 9% we are talking about. Without exports, we cannot grow. And as I said, we go back to that sort of a vicious circle. Like you cannot export because you're not competitive, and you're not competitive, and therefore you cannot export. So it's a kind of a very now. If you look at 4 important pillars, there's something which you'll hear more from Pritam and Amit, is how do we promote investments in intangible assets, human capital, skills, etc. An area this is where Kutch is also working upon very actively. Then the issue about development of inter- and intersectoral cooperation between firms, which is again very important. There we are looking at not only cluster-based approaches, but many other ways as to how firms can cooperate in order to take up the whole sector on sort of kind of a rising tide. Then to ensure fair competition, which is again very critical. Since while we are talking about cooperation between firms, we are not talking about collusion. Collusion is only something which hurts the economy rather than helps the economy. And something which we've seen reflected in a way in this this particular farmers' agitation, which has been going on for some time. And yesterday we had a terrible day, most unprecedented, where there was a ghera, or kind of a march on the Red Fort of the sort of unsocial elements of this particular agitation. What comes out from that particular agitation is, I mean, these laws are good, but the farmers are not very happy about it, particularly a section of farmers, not all the farmers. Because it is sort of taking them out of the frying pan to the fire, frying pan of the artiyas, the commission agents, then to the fire of monopolistic giants in the Indian industry, which could be foreign, it could be Indian, Ambani, Adani, etc. Therefore, you found an indirect sort of expression, or I would say a direct expression of that fear by when nearly 1,500 Reliance mobile towers were damaged by the agitating farmers. Now, why I mentioned this particularly was that we do have a competition commission in India, which is not as visible as it should be, particularly in many of these areas. And that's probably also because of the political economy constraints under which it is working. Having said that, let me now request Preetham to, in the next 5 to 7 minutes, Preetham works for as a consultant with the Asian Development Bank and has worked with several leading and one of the trade facilitation experts that we have in India. Preetham, over to you for 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you so much, Pradeepji, and thanks to you and Bipulji for making me a part of this conversation, and really privileged to be part of this August panel. I think, as Pradeepji mentioned, going straight into the kind of thoughts that I had shared in my paper, what I am focusing on is the theme of transforming vision into action. And what I basically mean by that is, I think the big ideas, the macro ideas that we have around any of these issues, how to achieve success, whether it's greater intersectoral cooperation to build better value chains, or creating more fair competition, even for our MSME participants. I think we have discussed a lot about what needs to be done. We have a fair idea of what needs to be done. We also have a fair idea what the action points are. What are some of the specific interventions that need to take place in order to achieve these goals, including the fact that now technology allows us to perhaps do far more many things in terms of how we can achieve these objectives to a large extent. I think where India on a relative basis slips up much more is on the frontline implementation in many of these areas. So what do I mean by that? See, essentially plumbing, as I call it, the facts on the ground, implementation on the ground, the organizational and managerial issues that you have on the ground, to implement all of these ideas are very contextual, very local, and they take a lot of hard work and time, which means they're often not attractive to the top level management of either bureaucracies or our political leaderships. These are not friendly to election cycles or news cycles, these kind of issues. Second, because they take a lot of effort and a lot of long persistent effort, is counterintuitive to the self-interest of even the middle level management of bureaucracies and even non-bureaucratic organizations, because they will not be around to get the credit for a lot of the achievements that will take place by the time any achievements do come through. So what that leads to is essentially, you have to have people thinking beyond their immediate self-interest, beyond the immediate business cycle in many cases. And it's not easy. It's not easy to achieve that. And you need to have institutions and a culture of institutions around that, which will help you get there. Countries which have got there have done it through this. I know it sounds a bit of motherhood and apple pie, and I'll try to explain with one single example, perhaps, what I mean by this. So let's take the concept of fair competition. Let's extend it beyond what Pradeepji was mentioning about the competition commission kind of ideas to, do our MSMEs have fair access or a fair chance at success? One important element of that would be, do they have fair access to credit? Based on objective criteria, can an MSME entity get the kind of credit it needs at the competitive rates? Now, we know that this is something we need to do. That's the macro vision. Second, The action items are well known now. We are discussing them. We have all these digital silos, the GSTN network, the EPFO for the HR, your export related data, your data for the bank. Everything is available. So the data that you can use to objectively uh, gauge the creditworthiness of any entity is there for us. But implementation would require taking all of this and creating a culture at every bank branch, getting every bank manager, or the non-banking financial companies to adopt them, use them in an objective manner, and ensure that credit flows to the right people. So that transformation, that last mile transformation, is the where I think the challenges are. Even if we look at, let's say, the unfair regulatory burden or disproportionate regulatory burden on MSMEs, even there, I think we have done a very good job in identifying what our doing business challenges are and the action points, what we need to do to address them. But this would also mean in the implementation level to go to every municipal office, the district zonal offices for different departments, to go to the ground level and see that those millions of transactions that take place between firms and regulators, between individuals and regulators, are actually meeting those doing business kind of ecosystem we have envisioned. And that requires a lot of capacity building on the ground level, a lot of reforms which are very contextual to local conditions. Before I kind of wrap up, I would like to talk, because my focus here is on institutions and institutional capacity to deliver these reforms in a persistent manner on the ground. We need to expand our thinking of what these institutions are. Let's not restrict them to just governmental institutions. So when we talk about, for example, developing intangible capital on skills and on technology and knowledge, well, you have business associations working with academic institutions. So every university administration, the different business association, the leadership and the secretariat of these institutions are equally important. What kind of capacity do these have to take these initiatives forward? You have sector skills councils, they're kind of public private. So you have all kinds of mixes over here. You have the state industrial development corporations which have a role to play. To what extent are they up to speed to take that vision and transform it into action? So if I just to close, if I talk about institutions, and I think what we need to deep dive through this initiative is look at three things about institutions. One is institutional ability. And what do I mean by that? Does the institution have capacity to deliver on its terms of reference? Are the officers competent? Do they have the competence to deliver on the terms of reference? And most importantly, this institution have a memory of its own. It's not dependent on one leader, one great person, and when that person leaves, kind of things fall apart. That's one. The second is the institutional strength aspect of it. And here there are three, again, I talk about three criteria. One is access. Is the institutional properly accessible to all the stakeholders who need to access it? Second is accountability. To what extent is is the institution accountable to its stakeholders for performance? Last, does it have formal comprehensive SOPs to achieve its terms of reference, including exception management when things go wrong? Does it have that in place or not? The last one is the institutional credibility, and this is very, very important. First factor of that is trust. Do the stakeholders trust these institutions to deliver in the first place? Is that ecosystem there? Second, can it engender collaboration for collective action? Great example is, if you want to have intersectoral cooperation, your cluster level organizations, your business associations, all of these have a role to play. Can these serve as platforms for that collaboration to happen? Do the stakeholders trust it as a platform for collective action? Last but not the least, for credibility, do you have instruments of approbation, as I call them? In the sense, if certain stakeholders within these institutions are not meeting the terms of reference or are actually actively harming or doing regressing the terms of reference to an extent, are there instruments by which they can be taken to task? Are there credible instruments like that? So if do all our institutions on the ground, panchayats, municipalities, small business associations, your sector skill councils, universities, there's a whole gamut of them. If you look at the range of issues we are discussing, there's a whole gamut of these institutions that deliver these, who transform the vision into action on the ground. Do our institutions meet up to the measures that we are setting for them, and what we can do to get them up to speed? So I think that those are my basic thoughts, open to questions. And once again, thank you to Cuts International and to Pradeep ji and Vipul ji for having me. Thank you.
Freedom, don't thank us so soon. We'll be asking you to come back. We'll be asking all panelists to come back. That's why we've kept the session to 2 hours. I'm so happy you spoke about the last point, approbation, as you spoke about. You didn't use the very colloquial words like corruption, which we see is so endemic that often institutions fail to deliver what they are required to deliver. And I can give you several examples from our own work. But let me leave it at that. And to say that this is one area which requires constant attack if you want to make the business easy as well as ensure that there are credible institutions. With that, let me turn to Amit Kapoor. Amit, over to you.
Yeah, hi Pradeep ji, thank you. Just wanted to share a small slide here with the group. So when we are really talking about competitiveness, and I think certain numbers that I thought I should share. One, of course, if we are saying that India is going to be a $5 trillion economy or whatever, first we need to understand and appreciate that India is seemingly a very small blip. Very quickly, like just wanted to share that if you really talk for India in terms of achieving the $5 trillion target, and if you look at the world economy, yes, India has grown significantly over the last few years, but on a global scale, we are at a fairly normal, what I call small level of contribution. We contribute close to about 2.7, 2.8% of the world GDP. And then there are severe issues that I actually see pertaining to the per capita incomes and things. And that leads us to a very important question from a competitiveness viewpoint. And that is about like, how do we achieve social objectives and economic objectives as we actually move forward? In fact, this whole crisis has actually shown something very, very startling, and that has been that India severely lacks the social infrastructure that we need to actually focus on. And when you talk about social infrastructure from the perspective of, say, health and so on and so forth, but going beyond it, what we have really seen getting exposed is the lack of what I call digital infrastructure to really take care of education, because this whole situation has also shown us very, very strongly that the divide that we actually have from an information technology viewpoint or from an access viewpoint is fairly severe. That has actually created a very huge setback from a learning point of view. We might hear some positive stories, definitively. I'm just trying to really say as to what more needs to be done here, because from a certain point in terms of, say, education, like the kids have not been able to get to school for a 1 year. And if somebody is not going to school for 1 year, that means the learning gap can actually rise by about 6 years for that student. So I'm not saying it is going to be for 6 years, but then there has been that huge gap that actually existed, and we need to actually be very, very careful about it. Having said that, I think there are multiple sets of things that we need to actually look at. And just looking at from a Porter's framework, as you said, like, so if you really talk about from a factor conditions point of view, that is, what do we do with our labor? There are issues in terms of the labor that I actually see, and we need to really tackle it very, very quickly. One of the things that has actually happened is the falling labor participation rate for women. That's a very startling effect, because the moment we are actually seeing that fall in labor participation rate, that means there is going to be a detrimental effect that we are going to see. There are the learning outcomes that we are actually seeing across the institutions. In fact, if you really look at the data, like there is more and more data that is actually coming out, which is exposing us to our learning, what I call impact that we have, whether at the school level or at the higher education level. If you talk about MBAs, only about what I call 10% or 12% of the MBAs are employable. To engineers, which is even lower. And there are some statistics which say that only about 40% of or 46% of Indian people who are going to college are employable. So there are issues in terms of the learning impact. So we need to really focus on that very, very quickly. In fact, when I say education, healthcare, it is imperative that if we are not able to set those things right, all the other things will start falling on the wayside. Because if we are not able to use our labor, which is our biggest resource, we have been talking about a dividend, but I think we have to really find ways to use that dividend in a much stronger way. We do get excited with what is happening in the West, but we have to really look inwards in terms of saying as to what we really need to do much more strongly as we move forward. The second thing we really talk about is when you talk about education itself, there is this whole huge R&D aspect that we need to be looked at. So there are issues in terms of like how innovative India actually is over a period of time. In terms of, say, the R&D expenses that we actually do, or expenditure that India actually does, is probably one of the lowest in the world. From a GDP point of view, we are close to about 0.7%, but most of the R&D investment actually happens through the government. The private sector is actually not playing a very strong role in R&D investments as well. So there is always a way that we can actually go on to say that our government is wrong, but there are issues as to how the private sector has to function and how private sector needs to contribute. So the private sector has not been fundamentally looking at R&D, innovation, and so on and so forth. And when I say innovation, there are issues which we have to understand from a productivity viewpoint. India is actually having a huge issue from a productivity viewpoint. In fact, from my point of view, India faces a productivity crisis. And when you talk about productivity crisis, in fact, say if you really talk about the contribution per person across different sets of industries, there are very massive gaps that we can actually see. Even if you talk about one of the most, talked about industry like IT, the productivity between a software engineer in India vis-a-vis, say, Israel could be as high as about 25 times. Or India is 1/25 of a software engineer in Israel. So how do we really set those sets of issues right? The second thing, if you really look at which we are facing right now, is about the demand crunch that we are facing. And demand crunch is something that we have been facing for a long, long time. Especially if you really look at post-COVID, I think this COVID has also given us time to think. It has also really exposed a few situations that we are looking at. But then how do we really look at the tax burden that actually goes on to people? Where are the disposable incomes? And because if you're really looking at creating India as a a demand-driven system, there are going to be challenges to that itself. I am of the view that we are severely taxed. At least there seems to be a huge gap that actually happens at the top end. The taxation levels are huge. Probably there could be some unique ways of really looking at people making investments. If people have money, they can actually make investments. So probably create a system that they invest in enterprises, startups, and so on and so forth. But then you have to really get that money into the system. And then, of course, how do we create that stimulus that we actually have to think? The third aspect that we have to look at is about related and supporting industries. We do talk about clusters, but I think we have fundamentally not seen as to what sectors should we actually focus on. India seems to be just getting obsessed. If you really look at the state level, or if you talk about India level, we want to do everything under the sun. We want to pick up on a 2-digit code, like we'll say, oh yes, all the 15 set of industries that we should focus on. But what is it that we want to focus on as a country is going to be very, very important. And that goes to the level of states as well. If you ever look at a state plan that we see, the state plan will always say, oh yes, we have to just focus on every industry under the sun. But then you have to understand that every state can actually have some positives, and they need to focus on that. That is where you build your competitiveness, your competitive advantage. And then, of course, there are issues of resource curse that we actually see across different sets of locations. If you talk about places like Bihar, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, very resource-rich places, but a typical resource curse situation exists there. We have somehow not been able to actually use the right set of models to really propagate or push forward with the what we call massive lack of either infrastructure or outcomes or outputs and things. And then, having said that, there are, from a firm point of view, Preetam was talking about institutions, and when you really talk about institutions, like there are issues that we can actually look at, and one of the foremost issue that I actually see from a competitiveness point of view is the regulatory burden that India actually faces. Today, as an enterprise, the regulatory burden that an enterprise has is absolutely severe. It can be seen as catastrophic because the number of forms that you're actually wanting to fill up, the compliance things that you're looking at. Say for a general entrepreneur, a small entrepreneur who's probably in the medium scale, close to about 30 to 40% of his time would actually be going into compliance issues. So rather than thinking forward, rather than being productive, rather than looking at innovation, he gets into compliance issues which are having a severe impact on his ability to contribute. So if you really look at what we need to do is, of course, there are 4 things or 4 pillars on which we will have to actually act on the factor conditions, on issues of land, labor, capital, on demand conditions. Yes, sir.
Would you like to wind up?
Yes, just 1 minute. On issues of demand conditions, and look at some sectoral aspects that we need to look at, what sectors we should focus on, and then, of course, make things easier for business. That is what we need to immediately do or else the target of say 5 trillion, we are talking about a long period of time. And given the situation today, it's going to be even more challenging. Over to you, Pradeep ji.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You two have. Let me pick up one or two issues that you raised. I mean, it's not that the other issue is not important. One is productivity. I think that is very critical, but that varies according to the geographies across the world and the kind of ecosystem that you provide to the worker to ensure that you have a high productivity. And there are various studies to show that as well. Now, regulatory burden is something which both Preetham and you spoke about, and we continuously work on that. In fact, we did a very major event with the Scotch Public Policy Forum last week, a week before last, on this particular issue, where Manish Sabarwal, who has this data on his fingertips, defines it as regulatory cholesterol. And that is something. Now, the underlying problem with the regulatory cholesterol is the lack of trust. You don't trust, business doesn't trust the government doesn't trust business, people don't trust business, and less of government. So there's a kind of vicious cycle, I would say, of mistrust, which then leads to that. Now, an important point raised by Preetham was, and two important points which I think are important if we have to get this discussion forward in a way that we're able to do something. One is plumbing. We require a lot of plumbing to be done. The second issue which he raised is the level playing field between a small and medium enterprise versus the medium and large enterprises. That is certainly a big problem in India that we see. And again, Amit, your field work and our field work and people's field work has all shown that very clearly. So there is, empirical evidence to prove a point rather than to speak about it as a rhetorical issue. With that, let me now therefore turn to Jagat Shah. Jagat, are you there?
Yeah, I'm
Jagat?
there. Yeah, Pradeep ji, I'm there.
Yeah, good. And another 5 to 7 minutes. And before that, let me welcome Ratin Roy.
Good. Thank you, Pradeep ji, for this opportunity. So, friends, I just want to share my field experience. I primarily work with small, medium enterprises in many countries, of course, India. And to me, what we are discussing today, to me, I feel that it is more, I will speak more on the implementation front. See, policy framework, economic policy, industrial policy, export policy, all these things. But what are we doing with the implementation? I'll give some examples and I will relate it to competitiveness. I primarily work with small, medium enterprises to connect them to global markets. And I work in clusters across many, many countries. So my work is in that domain. This pandemic has brought 10 years later, what would have happened digitally now. So I'm saying that we are now in a knowledge economy, we are now in a digital economy, we are now in a work from anywhere economy in terms of at least service sector. And 66% of GDP of India is service sector. So I define competitiveness in 4 factors. Efficiently create goods and services that meet global market demand, leading to rising living standard for everybody in the society, and that is sustainable into the future. In these 4 parameters, what government should be doing and what private sector should be doing, and what government has done on policy framework, and what should be the implementation part. I'll give some quick example of my learnings. Recently, Udyog Manthan has been going on. I have been part of many of those sessions by Ministry of Commerce and trying to bring all stakeholders and sector-wise 32 sectors discussing. And in each one of that, I found that every SME is saying, I want to upgrade technology, efficiently create goods and services, the first parameter. But where is the access? I don't have access to technology. I am small. I don't know where is technology. How to find? Can we, I propose, can we have one world-class technology showcase center? Why 10? Why in every state? We have limited resources. Why not only one world-class? And that will give an access, right? So that's the implementation part, the ease of doing business part, we all know. I work in exports area. we have export policy, we have export incentives. For 1 year, the export incentive is not disbursed. 1.5 years, 2 years. What is the meaning of that export incentive? Where is ease of doing business, right? GST refund we are not getting, industry not getting. How do they? So these are the more of a operational challenges. Policy is there. There is policy of export incentive, but do they get it, right? On triple helix, many people, two people have spoken earlier, the government academia industry linkage. Most weak, the academia to industry linkage is so poor. It is so poor. You know, I mean, absolutely not. So the World Bank report on education on India last year says 85% fresh engineering graduates not employable. Forget how many got employed, not employable, right? So huge work needs to be done there. I don't know the new education policy, how soon it will be adopted, but even that is, I think, not yet touching upon, for example, I used to work in China. I was working in a Chinese textile company for 6 years as a CEO. In China, innovation, Amit spoke about innovation and R&D. In China, innovation is a subject from class 5. What magic is required to include that as a subject, 2-page, 3-page subject in our schools? From the childhood, the kid is going to get that thought process of innovation and R&D. That is a matter of implementation, right? And we have got so many innovation councils and so many innovation bodies. Policy, institutions, everything is there. My pain point is only implementation, right? Look at the second part, that meets global market demand. When pandemic started, the exhibitions which used to take place around the world, they converted into virtual expos. You will be surprised with the data I share with you. Between June to December last year, 950 virtual expos took place. And out of that, 820 were by China. Where was India? We are an IT country. We are an IT power. We are exporting our IT to the world. We are not using in India. Virtual expos. This is something which government should have picked up and started running, like China has done it. So this is the implementation part. And now it will continue. Let pandemic go away. Virtual expos are not going to go away. It's going to be a hybrid model now. So is there some implementation on that? Permanent expo, like now times have come when our goods should be available nearer to the market. You need a warehouse, you need a permanent expo in some country. Which country? Largest trading partner of India is US. You go to any exhibition, anywhere in China, always you will find so many Chinese companies under one roof. First of all, we don't find Indian companies there. Why? Because our market access initiative scheme is there in the Ministry of Commerce. Go and look at the fund utilization of that scheme. So less. We have a warehouse scheme. I remember 500 crore rupees is the fund in that. Last year, 6 crore was utilized. I'm talking of 2019, not pandemic year. Warehouses, you are making available goods nearer to the market. 75% government is giving refund to the exporter. But how? Through Export Promotion Council. You make an application as an SME to Export Promotion Council that I want to take this. They don't even reply to you. Policy is there. Where is the implementation? Right? Global brand. I was in a gems and jewelry session of the Udyog Manthan, and I said, what is the identity of India in gems and jewelry? It is our handmade jewelry. Is our identity. Should be built as a brand. Should be positioned as a brand. Otherwise, China is also doing jewelry. Very soon we will lose the competitive edge in the diamond cutting which we are doing. It's a labor-oriented work. So can we have one global brand promoted, supported by government? Can we have this permanent expo? Government should only spend money in creating an infrastructure. It should be run by private sector. Government cannot do any business. It's like a business. It's like running a business. I am from Ahmedabad. Vibrant Gujarat used to take place here. Government started. Initially, they funded. It is a profit-making activity run by private sector. The last Vibrant Gujarat which took place, the organizer, I worked with him. I'm his partner actually. We made 18 crore rupees in Vibrant Gujarat. Forget the government, zero government funding. Government should set up something, private sector should run it. E-commerce, where are we? E-commerce. Government, now I'm hearing government is trying to work with Amazon to put all our small medium enterprises into the international market. And then other day I was reading that Amazon is saying that already by 2019, 15,000 crores of exports took place by Indian companies through Amazon platform, overseas platforms. So can such an initiative take place? We are an IT country. Let government try to set it up. They have got funding to do all this. They let private sector run it. Warehouse abroad, same situation. This is about global market, leading to rising living standard for everybody in the society. Women, so Stand Up India program is there. You apply, ask one woman to apply for Stand Up India loan. See what happens. Your startup champions now has come up. 5 years I was saying, wow, what is it in Shark Tank which India cannot do? What is it in Shark Tank which India cannot do? And it can be done online. You don't need a TV to do that, right? So Startup Champions has come. That is what Amit was talking of, the intangible. Knowledge economy is about intangible assets. Villages, smart city program is there. I remember I used to work with Mr. Modi as a chief minister. I accompanied to him to many, many foreign tours, particularly China. And I used to always say, when smart city was launched, I said 65% population even today lives in villages. Are we doing smart city for 35% population? Will we be able to do a smart city even in 20 years? Forget it. So much of migration taking place from villages to cities. We should do smart village. We have 630,000 villages in India. Build 200 smart village. Let it be. You can do it faster. You can do it in, my theory is you can do it in 1,000 days. You can do convert smart village, 4,000 people village in 1,000 days. Showcase, have lessons, village, let there not be migration. Youngsters are leaving villages. There is no work to do. They are living good life in village. Now they are living in slums in city. Anytime you think they will be able to buy a 50 lakh rupees house in a city.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So, is.
Could you like to conclude? We'll come back to all the panelists.
Yeah. So my Pradeep ji, my point is only like this, that policies are there. Institutions are there. I think political will is also there presently. Implementation is something which needs to be looked upon on every policy matter. That's it.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, as somebody said, and it was not humorous, there are 3 problems that we have in our policy. Implementation, implementation, and implementation. This has been said many times. It's like that movie, The Dirty Picture. What does the film industry do? Entertainment, entertainment, and entertainment. Now, that is a question which has also been raised by somebody in the audience. And may I request the audience that if they can continuously send in their questions through the chat box here. Now, we are talking about institute. You spoke about the problem with the small and medium enterprise often is that, as you very rightly said, they write to EEPC and they don't even get a reply. Our councils are really extension of the government, and in fact, worse than many government departments at times. Now, Amit has spoken about productivity. Now, how many of you know that there is a National Productivity Council in India with a fantastic building on Lodi Road, a very premier spot? What does it do? Zilch. It just runs training programs like any other organization it does. On the contrary, I have had personal exposure to the Australian Productivity Commission, which is a fantastic institution. I mean, we have models of this around the world. Now, when you talk in terms of institutional capability, has nobody spoken about Productivity Council? What does it do? What is its mandate? It is also under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, by the way. This is an issue which should be raised as to these catalytic institutions were conceptualized, visualized as important aspects of this whole economic development rubric, but they are not functioning properly. With that, may I now turn to Naina Lal Kidwai. Naina Lal Kidwai is a banker, or has been a banker, and has also been president of FICCI. She comes in with very varied experience of the whole economy as such, from the practitioner's perspective. Naina, over to you, 5 to 7 minutes.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pradeep. And Amit, for bringing back Michael Porter into my vocabulary and life. I had the good fortune of studying under him when I was at the Harvard Business School. And to you, Preetham, for raising the whole institutional issues in such a coherent manner. So, hearing what I think is actually quite a depressing start to this day, I maybe want to add to some of the issues to just broaden some of the factor-related issues, which I think become very important for us to tackle. And I'll quote from the CEO and owner of Li and Fung. And for those of you who know Li and Fung, they send out $20 billion from China, and they started production in India with a view to growing India as a base over a decade ago. And he would despair about costs. And interestingly, it wasn't about labor productivity and cost. He said they were producing, it was really garments in India, outside Chennai, at 10% below what they were producing in northern China in the dorms that they would put labor into in China. So India was actually pretty competitive from a labor productivity standpoint in his eyes. But we lost that entire competitiveness through the logistics of what was 140 kilometers to the port and out of the port. So the logistics of it, and in logistics, it's the regulatory mess, the forms, the time it takes to get to the port, out of the port, and to the market, is where I think lies the tragedy and the disservice we do our labor. So just to bring that into the equation. A second area where actually there has been some interesting reform, particularly from the renewable space, is the cost of power. That still remains an issue, but improving. So I think we're on the right track there. And the third, where I really don't easily see a solution, is the cost of capital. Because as long as we have inefficient dispensers of funding through public sector banks, who, to be fair to them, aren't only just doing banking, they have a lot of charity in there through priority sector lending, etc. The cost of that comes out somewhere, and that adds to the cost of competitiveness for industry as a whole. And it gets worse as you go into the inclusion space, because the very ones who need cheaper interest costs are the very ones that pay more for it. And I think there was some allusion to, women entrepreneurs, etc. as well. I should just add, as women entrepreneurs go, and I've been interacting with a few, over 60% of them who are first-time borrowers through the COVID downturn, because they were in businesses to do with, garments, exports, and sometimes quite small, had never borrowed before because their inclination was not to borrow. But when they went to borrow, because they had no credit history, there was no one there to lend to them. Okay. What I would just add to some of the points made, and regulatory delays, trust, I think all of these are very, very material issues. Anecdotally, I would just now come to the MSME group on an issue, and Nitin, you'll appreciate this because we are on the same page on making sure that the ESG type norms, or certainly environmental norms, are adhered to by the MSME sector. But I was at Bombay Airport, this is a long time ago now, over a year ago, and I had some unknown guy just come and plonk himself down beside me as I was waiting to board a flight. And he basically said, I'm all for everything that's required of me in terms of compliance, but I just don't have the bandwidth and ability to ensure that I can do the effluent control. And I would rather that in the cluster where we all exist outside Delhi, the government provides this and we pay for the service. So why aren't we looking at this? That if you're in a cluster, have the institutional provision to ensure proper water, electricity, effluent treatment, waste disposal, and charge for it. But the model that we work to is the compliance burden that we stick onto the MSME, and I believe directionally right, but again, so poorly thought through and so badly executed that it just ends up with harassment. This particular guy, through all of this, was sharing with me, and this is well before COVID, that he had to cut back his staff by half, and the issues he was having, just which what was already evident was the downturn at the time. So I think when we look at the frameworks in which we look to take industry forward, particularly the small guys, the MSMEs, we have to look at the provision of the infrastructure in a way that it can be plug and play. And whether it's a startup or indeed a manufacturing outfit, which is, fairly scaled, if we can provide this plug and play environment, we take care of everything from the institutional issues of the compliance burden and forms and some of those services that are required, but equally the infrastructure. I would just also add that as we look at this whole issue of trust and relationships, I think at the core of it today, and I can certainly speak for maturer industry, I despair when I think about how many are really going offshore to set up businesses rather than set them up here, because they're kind of, they've had it. And so I asked them, what is it? I mean, you've made your money here, you've done okay. Why have you suddenly turned off India? And it always comes back to the regulation, the compliance burden, the headache. It's no fun running a business here, and the fear of failure. In the Indian context, businesses that fail, you are a thief, you're a robber, you are somebody who has absolutely taken the banks for a ride. And unfortunately, there are enough of those examples. But equally, we have to recognize that failure in business is a given. And that setup has to be set in a way that we can differentiate between the scumbags and those that are genuine. And how we deal with that failure then becomes important, both as society goes, as a bank goes, as government goes, as the compliance norms go. It's a tough ask because we're not used to looking at business this way. Business is always seen as corrupt and in fact working in cahoots with a corrupt system, and which begets which is always hard to say. But I think that is so fundamental to the way we look at businesses that it affects everyone, whether it's a little startup that's just trying to get going for the first time or a large business. So addressing this, whether it is through a huge messaging, which actually started, I mean, this government actually started, I think it was Arun Jaitley in his opening budget, I remember saying, business is good, we need business, but that all very quickly disappeared down the drain, where we saw business after business being really, put on the mat. So
thank you. Naina, would you like to wind up for this time?
So I'm pretty much done in terms of, I would love to see the inclusive agenda of making sure that our small businesses have the advantage of credit, have this plug and play type of environment, which takes the compliance burden away on the one hand, and on the other, that the factors of production are indeed properly addressed.
Thank you. Long ago, there was a draft to enable the number of inspectors, a kind of convergent inspectors for small industries. But that was never implemented properly by the states because of the turf issues which arises, which again is another major problem that we have in terms of plumbing, is the lack of whole of government approach. And departments working in silos, which only creates more problems. And as has been rightly pointed out by you and by many others before us, is the small and medium enterprises are at a greater disadvantage than with the larger enterprises who can afford to hire staff to deal with many of these issues. With that, let me come to Shailesh Pathak. Shailesh has been in the government, has been in the IS for 15 years, and then quit the IS and joined banking, and now he's working in the infrastructure sector with the L&T. Shailesh, over to you, 5 to 7 minutes or?
Thank you, Pradeep. Just a clarification, actually, I began my career with 4 years in ICICI, the
Okay.
Development Finance Institution. And I wanted to go to Wall Street, but then public service beckoned. So very briefly, we're talking about improving India's competitiveness for inclusive growth. I would actually rephrase this as how can I make Bihar as competitive as Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra? Because nothing can be more inclusive, right? So with that sort of perspective, let me put forward 4 points. The first is, and even before I go to the first point, I'd like to have a word on China. Now, I don't know how many of you are the eldest child in your family, but I am not. I had an elder sister, and I would not have been born in China. I don't know about you guys. Some of you may be the eldest, you might have been born in China. Most of you would not have. So anytime there's a comparison with China, this reality check that a government that can control how many children you can have can control a lot else. Uh, the added advantage that they have is that almost all their sort of top level officialdom has proved their worth in implementation and execution. So you have to be a mayor of Shanghai or Beijing or one of the largest cities before you get a ticket to the head table. So maybe a good idea for India is that the prime minister has to have compulsorily spent at least 1 year either as the chief minister of a state or as a mayor of a 10 lakh plus city. So suddenly the emphasis and the focus on execution will be obvious. But let me move to my 4 points. The first is, I believe that the single biggest factor that will hold back India from being competitive is horrible city governance. And cities are not going to get better in India for a long, long time because we have deliberately made cities as slaves of state governments. And we've made sure that the political leadership of cities is stunted. So in the recent COVID episodes, I've come across so many global examples of so many city leaders saying we want to do this in our city. I have not come across one single example of any Indian city political leaders saying we want to do this. So I'll come with a longer explanation. But the quicker we can urbanize, Bihar is the least urbanized state in India. Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu are the most urbanized. The difference in economic development competitiveness is evident. And before, one of the earlier speakers said, why can't we make smart villages? Whether we like it or not, India will be 50% urban by 2042. The quicker we can get the people in Bihar's villages out to cities, the quicker we can make Bihar more competitive. The second point is contracts and rule of law. We've all talked about World Bank competitiveness and contracts, but the one place where we have not improved at all is contract enforcement. And while we are talking, my company, as a part of the larger L&T group, runs some toll roads which we have constructed, invested, and now we're collecting toll to get return on investment. For exactly 32 days now, at our Panipat toll plaza, we have not been able to collect toll. And we've already lost something like a 7 to 8 crore number. Who's going to give this back? So why should we invest? L&T operates in 30 countries. This doesn't happen in 29 countries. So rule of law and contract enforcement, how are we going to get it more focused? The third point is the judicial ecosystem. Dispute resolution in our country is a mess. While it is tied with the rule of law and contract enforcement, the judicial ecosystem is the reason for our country's corruption, because the corrupt think that they can get away with it by indefinitely prolonging the judicial system, whereas you should actually have an acquittal or a conviction within 1 year. And that is what happens in more competitive countries. And the last thing is, Bimal Jalan in his Future of India talked about public-private dichotomy. He said that the private sector will improve, innovate, whereas the government sector would not improve and innovate. That's one of the reasons I decided to get out and rejoin the private sector. But What we are now seeing is the union versus state dichotomy. I see a whole lot of innovation and improvement in the union government. I do not see this kind of improvement in the state governments, particularly a state like Bihar. So the kind of innovations that have happened in the last, whatever, 10 years in the union government, think getting a passport, we are far more competitive than most. But has it happened at the city level? Has it happened at the state level? Most of the regulatory burden that we talked about is actually at the city level and maximum at the state level. The regulatory burden at the union government level is not very evident, which is why I would actually say that Preetham's analysis on institutional capacity is exactly what we should be focusing about. Institutional capacity, institutional strength, and institutional credibility. The kind of institution that we have in a Trichy Municipal Corporation or a Nashik Municipal Corporation. Do we have that in Patna Municipal Corporation? Uh, unless we get over this union-state dichotomy in terms of innovation, the kind of Aadhaar linking that has happened in union government programs, has it happened in state government programs? So the question, as we always say, is not about what to do it. I mean, what to do. It is about how to do it. And unless we get our Nagar Nigams, our municipal corporations going, I mean, Bihar should be aggressively urbanizing. Patna and Darbhanga should be attracting people. Instead, Patna and Darbhanga are exporting their rural areas to Tirupur in Tamil Nadu and Pune in Maharashtra. So, I'm just concluding by saying that we are very similar to the European Union. And we should stop talking about India as a country and start talking about the 54 districts that are net exporters of migrant laborers. Can we focus on those 54 districts? Because the European Union actually said that we will focus on the southern European countries, Portugal and Spain in particular. And within one generation, they turned around those two countries. Can we do the same thing with Bihar, Eastern UP, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha? These are the areas which need more inclusive growth. And this set of city improvements, contracts and rule of law, judicial ecosystem and dispute resolution, and union-state dichotomy, if we can work on these four in these 6 states, I think we'll make our country more competitive. Thank you.
Thank you, Sailesh, for another excellent presentation. By the way, this issue about urbanizing villages or creating urban infrastructure was floated by Abdul Kalam, our late president, and this was experimented also.
So I was actually part of the Pura experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
I would say that does not work.
I know, whatever it is. Yeah.
That the city corporation of Kanpur needs to be far more efficient than it is currently. Thank you.
I agree that city governments are hopeless, and particularly in spite of the 74th Amendment.
Oh, that the 74th Amendment has ensured that city governments will remain hopeless, because you have never heard of a mayor getting re-elected in India because he's or she is ineligible to run for election the next time. We can have a longer discussion.
Thank you very much, and that calls for a separate webinar. Totally. Having said that, we have some very interesting questions from the audience, which I think I would like to ask the rest of the panel to tackle to the extent that they would like to. Didar Singh has asked about the issue about technology, climate change, and pandemic as 3 important factors in terms of competitiveness in times to come. And may I request Nitin Desai that if you would like to speak on these as well as any other thing that he has in mind in the context of how do we improve our competitiveness. We do end up talking about economic development in many ways, but as I said, I'm struck by one particular word raised by Preetham is plumbing. We require a lot of plumbing, and we've got too many leakages in our system. Regulatory burden is something which everybody has spoken about, and everybody is working on it, including us. And yet we continue to move the mountains because of the endemic corruption. And many of you may not know, but corruption has only expanded exponentially. There's no place where, talking about small and medium enterprises, none of our field surveys, a woman entrepreneur was crying that she was given a loan of 5 lakh rupees under Mudra, And the manager says, give me 50,000 rupees before which I'll, release the loan. And she said, well, I don't have 50,000 rupees. I'm just giving you an example, and this is not anecdotal. This is quite universal. Nitin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I feel a little inhibited because I think we've heard some wonderful stuff from people who have far more practical experience at the ground level than I have. So let me just limit myself to a few things. One of the things that I gather from what I've heard from people is the government is trying to do too much. It's trying to do too much. Why have we got a National Productivity Council? Shouldn't the government be focusing on the policies which will influence the people who run industry or towards productivity increase, rather than setting up an institute for national productivity, which has not done anything for the past 60 years that it has been in existence? They even set up one, I think, on technology development with Krishnamurthy some time back. I don't recollect anything coming out of that process. Let the government focus on what it ought to be doing. To give an example, which Naina mentioned, that really the issue on exports that she saw there was something the government ought to be doing, which is logistics. The building of roads, the improvement of ports, etc. That will have a far greater effect than, frankly, the labor cost, labor productivity is not going to be influenced greatly by what the government is going to do. It is going to be influenced by what industry is going to do. And let the industry work on that itself, and let the government focus on what industry cannot do, which is, say, for instance, logistics side. So my feeling is that we really ought to be not asking the government to do 101 different things. Let it focus on what its responsibilities are, on fiscal policy, on monetary policy, on labor laws, on trade policy, etc. Rather than starting to become as if they are like a corporate strategy unit sitting in Delhi, telling people how to improve productivity, how to improve technology innovation, etc., etc. All you will do is end up with lots of employment for people who have very little direct practical knowledge. Second point, the point which was raised very dramatically by Shailesh, which is, I saw a list in one of the two papers about the clusters of rising industries. And if you saw that list of clusters, except for Noida, all of them were in the west and the south, none in the north or the east. Have a look at that list. I can't remember which paper it is, whether it is in Amit's paper or Pritam's paper, but it is there. And that's a reality, that we have a west and a south, which is actually not doing too badly, which is actually moving ahead, which probably needs less government, not more government, except in certain areas like logistics, urban development, and so on. And what the government ought to be focusing on in terms of its support is what can I do in the north, what can I do in the east? Incidentally, one thing that I would like to add, draw a little, Shailesh mentioned urbanization as a major source of growth. Yes and no. Have a look at Bengal. Bengal is a highly urbanized place. Is it growing? Is it, there are things other than urbanization which also count in whether the thing is going to move ahead or not. And one final point, the point that was raised about China and the quality of its leadership. We tend to think of China as a dictatorship, which is true, but it's a very complex dictatorship. What you have there is a 3-tier system. You have people at the ground level who work by participating mainly in the Communist Party. If they establish themselves as effective, they get moved to the next level, mayor of Shanghai, etc., etc. And the recruitment at the top is basically based on their performance as a mayor in Shanghai or as a head of a provincial unit or something like that. And the reason that happens is there is then you put in a term limit. Nobody stays there more than 2 terms, which of course she is getting out of, but till it was applied. And that means there was a process. People understood, yes, we have to get new people in. And that you're absolutely right, that in many ways, it's a system which is semi-democratic, if I may say so. in some ways, it is more effective than our system in rewarding merit. Our system may be more open, UPSC exams, open politics, etc. But I suspect that their system is better in rewarding merit. So my reflections on what people are saying is basically let the government focus on what the gaps are, not on everything, and certainly not on trying to act as a think tank for corporate sector or industry or any such thing. The issue of small and medium industries was brought in. And here I want to put my quick second point. We must think of competition in a sense more broader than the structural issue of how, market share or even market impact issue. We have said this in many reports of cuts on this, that competition depends not just on your law on competition commission, etc., but also on trade policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, etc., etc. This is a point that we have made. But more than that, understand that what we really ought to be doing is to focus on the consumer and balance between the seller and the buyer in the market. That's a problem in agriculture. I have lakhs of sellers confronted by a limited number of buyers if I were to privatize. And that is quite different from what I have in the manufacturing sector, where I have lakhs of buyers with a limited number of sellers. Now, that's a big difference. And the nature of the imbalance between the seller and the buyer is further increased by the seasonality of supply in the agricultural market, whereas the demand is not at all seasonal. It's more or less even through the year. So the person who has the capacity to hold, has the monetary resources to hold stocks, has an advantage relative to the others. So when we talk of competition, particularly when you start talking about farming and small industries, we ought to be looking at it more broadly than in terms of structural issues alone. And I think this is very important, and this is a point which Kutz has been raising again and again. On the points raised by your question, on which I'll say focus on climate, COVID, I'm not terribly sure I can say that much. But on climate, I think basically the key issue as far as productivity and growth is concerned here is going to be on our energy policy and how our energy policy operates. That's what's going to have the immediate impact. But it's also a potential area of opportunity, as China has discovered and is exploiting in terms of its activities on electric vehicles, in terms of its activities on renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. So the climate can be a potential for countries where the infrastructure has yet to be built. That is our advantage. The infrastructure that will exist in India in 2030 most of it has not yet been built, particularly on the construction side. This is our advantage, which we must learn how to exploit when it comes to climate change. There are, of course, more positive, more challenging things we have to do on climate, which we can talk about at some other time. I don't have much to say on the COVID issue, except my feeling, not a forecast, that it is going to affect the world economy in a way so that we may not necessarily see a revival of the old patterns of globalization based on value chains that happened during the 90s, which China exploited, that we may find a very different pattern of globalization post-COVID, particularly with the impact that COVID is having on the West, which is not going to go away that quickly with the sort of resurgence that they're seeing. Not for another couple of years at least, you will see the economic impact of COVID in the West. We will probably recover, but I don't think the West is going to recover that fast. That's my only thought on COVID. So let me just say that I've really learned a lot from what your panelists have said, and I look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nitin. And I'm sure all of us will continue to learn as this colloquium evolves over the next session in February and in March. And we would like you to come back, at least even as an audience, to attend them as we requested. An important question has again come up from the audience, which I thought I'll raise. Maybe Indira could respond to that after this. Is the district industry centers. They are absolutely useless, whether they are actually effective or not. That is something, and then again and again we go back to this whole issue about treating SMEs as our stepchildren, in the sense that they are not being given the kind of facilitation as they are required to do in order to be competitive, and their contribution to the GDP and to employment as a per capita basis is much higher than medium and large enterprises. Indira, over to you.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking all the previous speakers who've all made very good points. But since the ultimate product of this whole exercise is to present a paper to the government of India telling them what they should and should not do, let me begin by saying that the sense I get from all my years of residence in India, but outside government, is that the one thing that irritates government and government servants the most is being told by people like us from the outside what they should do and what they should not do. Typically, in any government department, the senior officers are dreadfully overworked because they're a very small sliver on the top. And even they feel powerless to change anything. So I don't think we should have this kind of very broad brush recommendation consisting of, improve skilling, improve education, improve nutrition, and have any sense at all that that is going to be heeded or listened to. It'll go straight into the waste paper basket. So let us have a clear idea of where we want to direct our message. And in order to do that, you have to watch government very carefully and get a sense of which departments in government currently are being given importance by the top leadership. And my sense is, please correct me if I'm wrong, I may not be the best observer or best assessor of this issue, but my sense is that the Department of, it used to be called the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, but since January 2019, it's been renamed as the Department for the Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade. It's not just because the department has been renamed, but I get the sense that they are being given a lot of importance within government. And surely the production-linked incentives, which is a program which set off got properly implemented from April 2020 and has been running well. Initially, it was addressed at 3 sectors. Subsequently, I think 12 were added on. I don't know the exact number. But from all these things, I get the sense that the DPIIT, sorry, the new name of the department, is where we really ought to be directing our message. So what is the particular message that I would wish to direct to them? And this is raised to addressed to the question which Pradeep picked up for me to look at. It's about district industrial centers. So what is the DPIIT? Is that it is functioning as a central government department. The department is not itself federally structured in terms of looking at states, looking at industries departments within states and at the district industrial centers, and networking with all of them to form a truly federal enterprise directed at improving industry, promoting industry and internal trade, which is by its name what it intends to do, what it is supposed to do. Now, we do have an experience in recent years of a federally structured institution, and that is the GST Council. Now, of course, the GST has not done very well. It has been badly designed. I've written a lot about that. But the GST Council itself, as a federal institution, which constantly consults state finance ministers, is a very, very good way of structuring a tax which had a national structure. So similarly, I think if DPIIT were to be restructured to have regular meetings with state industries departments and with district industrial centers, we could actually see some progress. And then let me give you a very, very specific instance of how we should go about this. And in passing, let me mention that Amit Kapoor, in his excellent paper, I thought it was a great paper, spoke about clusters and all that. But he asked the question, what sectors should we focus on? I think the whole problem with the way DPIIT has been going about things is this non-federal structuring, so that we start with our priors as to what sectors we should focus on and don't look at the federal process to tell us what sectors we should focus on. So let me give you a very specific example. There is an entrepreneur, an amazing entrepreneur, based in a village named Koilapalayam in Tamil Nadu. Villages in Tamil Nadu have unpronounceable names, but as you know, their descendants become vice presidents of the United States. So we need to pay attention to them. And there is an entrepreneur there who was able to produce with a dryland weed, which is called milkweed. He was able to spin from it a wool which is incredibly soft. He has founded a company called Faborg, and they manufacture 150 kilograms of yarn per month, which is a very, very small quantity. This has been bought by brands, most prominently a brand called Infantium Victoria. It's a German fashion label, which has been able to use this yarn produced from milkweed to make very, very soft woolen garments, which are softer even than cashmere. And this textile, this very soft textile, has been absolutely snapped up by designer labels to make the kind of clothing that only the super rich in the world can buy. So you're likely to see these coats worn by, let's say, British royalty or something like that. All coming from this milkweed, all coming from this entrepreneur who's producing at very, very small scale. But the nation doesn't know about it. DPIIT doesn't know about it. If they knew about it, they would immediately, scale up and if the DPIIT knew about it, they would scale up, not just this, but there must be many, many such examples of this. I just happened on this, preparing for this seminar. I wanted to give a very, very specific example. Just imagine what would happen if we could scale this up, produce a lot more yarn than 150 kilograms a month, produce the designer labels here itself, capture all that value addition in the country. Just imagine what this would mean for the local development of this village in Tamil Nadu, and how this could become a growth center. So this cannot happen if DPIIT sitting in Delhi decides, based on priors, what are the sectors we should focus on. We do have to federally structure every initiative, every institutional, every public sector initiative in such a country that it is truly federal, that it reaches down to absolutely the district industrial centers and the taluk industrial centers, if there is such a thing. Pick up on what entrepreneurial activity is being done across the spatial reach of this huge country, and build up from there. I'm going to stop here, but I really think the more specific we get and the more targeted we get, the more likely it is that our message will actually be heeded. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just to go back to Indira's point about district level focus, the Ministry of Commerce has now got a district level export promotion scheme. What is also more important is that the UP government, for example, has set a target of $1 trillion by 2025, so that they contribute 1/5 of what the government of India targets. And they have an excellent scheme which is going on, one district, one product. And that is something which even other states are trying to emulate, including Rajasthan, where we are situated. And that could create that focus. The second important point which you raised, Indira, is something what also was referred to by Shailesh in a different way. The issue about federal, the federal nature of our country is to how many of these policies often go top down and without proper consultation at the bottom level or bottom up. Bottom up again is very limited in that sense. And one thing which you very rightly said in your opening statement was the ability of the senior level management in the bureaucracy to be able to absorb. I mean, they're constantly doing firefighting. That is something which again are systemic problems which have to be addressed in one way or the other. May I now request Ratin? Ratin has quit NIPFP and is joined Overseas Development Institute in London as Managing Director for Research and Policy. Others are all well known to all of you. So, Ratin, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. I don't really know what I can say after so much rich and pointed discussion, but let me start by giving you the sense.
On implementation, Ratin, you've dealt with the Ministry of Finance at a close quarter.
That is not a place where things are implemented. Even in the limited measure one would expect them to be, but that doesn't matter. But I'm going to give you one positive example to the Ministry of Finance. No, but the point I wanted to make was that, I just turned 54. And I get this feeling I've been hearing this conversation all my adult life. And that is really surprising. Shailesh very rightly brought up the point that since I'm an only child, I would presumably have been born in China. But I wouldn't have said this if I were Chinese. I would have said this if I were Filipino. I'd probably have said this, going by my global experience, certainly if I were Brazilian or if I were Thai. And then you would get what we do. I was having this conversation over the weekend with a friend, praising Montek, since Montek is here. And I said, but the trouble is, you see, that moment was just a moment. It was not transformational. He said, well, at least we did something. So we have become, and she was right, at least we did something. But we have therefore become an economy where I think we are going through a schizophrenia of aspiration. Why do I say that? If you look at all the problems that have been enumerated today by both in the papers and by many others, these are not new problems. These are problems that we have had for 30 or 35. Well, majority of them we had since 1991, because many of these problems were irrelevant before 1991, because we didn't have a game going, right? So when a game comes, there are problems, and you solve those problems, and then there's transformation. I think one of the major reasons why these problems persist, I'm just putting this to you for consideration. I don't know how this can be implemented, and I certainly wouldn't look to government to do it. I think couple of people said, I think there is far too much expectation of a government which we simultaneously know is a weak government. Please understand that even with the central government, for all its merits, if you can't manage a reasonable defense procurement policy, you must not have high expectations of that government's instrumentation. So I'm quite sympathetic with poor budgeting in the Ministry of Finance when it occurs to me we can't even buy aircraft in an emergency, right? And what we have done therefore in COVID is fantastic, etc. But when we say fantastic, we are tempering our expectations from government, and that is a good thing. But the reason I think we need to temper our expectations from government is, and I've written about this, I think one of the things that we assumed would go away after 1991 was that India would cease to be, for most Indians, the kind of economy it was for me and Dr. Rajaraman and others here, maybe not Abhishek, before 1991, which was principally a rationed economy. And the game we were in was rationing. That is why it was so nice to join the army, not because you loved your country, you had a separate rationing system. If you're an engineer, you got out of this wretched country and went abroad. So you did that, and then if you found that you could make some money, if you were entrepreneurial, you stayed on, like Shailesh, right? I'm talking about the asset class of people, not individuals who are public-spirited or militaristically patriotic, right? So, and that rationing, I think our diagnosis was over after 1991. And I think we were wrong there, because what happened was that rationing was over for people like us. People like us now live largely unrationed lives. That is not true, I think, of about 60 to 70% of the Indian population, where to get a job, to get an education, to get health, right, to get a livelihood, to find a bride or a groom, they still have to enter a rationing economy where things go through contacts, networks. Remember, the marriage bureaus are also attempting rationing with changing parameters, right? There is only one way in which we have attempted to socialize the rationing system, and that has been the old caste system. And it persists for that reason. And it persists more emphatically in areas like rural areas in northern and eastern India, where rationing is ubiquitous. But if that is the case, then working back from that, the majority of government energy will be channeled to what it was channeled before 91, which is maintaining a rationing system, which is why I think many senior officers are in fact overworked. When I work in the States and I look at my IAS colleagues, even in Maharashtra, Rajasthan, you know for sure, A lot of the time is spent on, ministers calling up, asking for bypasses of the rationing system, things happening at the district level that you expect by. So many of these so-called offices, labor offices, etc., are used, I think, to reduce the ease of the difficulty of doing business for some. But the logic of that difficulty of doing business exists because we are a rationed economy, which is why we raise barriers and transactions costs. Right? So that is that economy, and then there is this economy. And these tectonic plates are now, I think, colliding in ways that are leading to what I feel is a permanent decline in our growth rate and our aspiration not to be the Philippines, and it really worries me. Accompanied with this, I think, is a knowledge within government. And here I agree with Indra. It is not good to go to government because I think they know that they're not running a serious business there. I'll give you one example. Look at the budget speech. Oh dear, dear, dear. 30 years ago, I used to wonder why Finance Minister of India has to talk about pan masala duties. I don't see that in 29 of the other 30 countries somebody mentioned. Right? A budget speech is a budget speech. You talk about the budget. They realized it was not a serious business budgeting in the old days. There wasn't much money. The deficit was sort of automatic. You had to spend money on what you spent. So he would talk about pan masala and this and that. Then I thought that went away. But then I find it persists. And the budget will speak about everything from philosophy to economics to industry, to industrial growth, to agricultural performance, to child labor. Now you have poets quoting things at you. And it's gotten longer and longer and longer and less and less and less focused, to the point where last year's budget speech did not even present the macro fiscal picture for the Indian economy. She didn't tell us revenue minus expenditure, how much fiscal deficit. She said, that's in the details. Go look. Go look. So that is not a serious government. That is a government that understands the limits of its own capabilities and therefore is low aspiration and therefore engages in the business of rationing. Now, if you take this teleology in the way I'm looking, then how does this affect productivity and competitiveness? And close there. मैंने ख्याल से जो प्रधानमंत्री, sorry, I don't know how many Hindi speakers are. I think when the Prime Minister suddenly came to the realization, and this is suddenly, about Atmanirbhar Bharat, because as long as I was at the PMEAC and before that, I didn't hear much Atmanirbhar. It seemed to have dawned upon us sometime between 2019 and COVID. Good, doesn't matter. That's how we do in India. We are not, so government is emphatically not a corporate strategy department for the country, and I think they know it. And I think he said this because, and I also think that a lot of our COVID, it's a different subject, economic policy response, the reason it was so focused on monetary and credit policy was that the capabilities of government to do what is expected of it, I think have finally been acknowledged to be very limited. And I think the Prime Minister in that sense is an honest man, and he has seen this, and therefore what we are being told is we are on our own. If we are on our own, I will conclude with 3 propositions.
Ratin.
Yes.
Before you conclude, there is a question to you specifically, which you might like to cover, which is raised also. In your op-ed on decolonizing climate action,
yeah,
you said there is a need to create affordable green tech solutions. So you could also,
it's a truism.
Right.
I have nothing more to say.
Okay.
It's a truism. I mean, you should create green tech solutions. Yeah. I mean, what's the default is you should not create them. There's no argument about that. So, yes.
Tautological arguments.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and they should be affordable. Otherwise, you'll go out of business, no? Yeah. Okay. So, then I have 3 points.
Yeah, 3 points.
Yeah. One is, I think we should look for successes in this very depressing ecosystem I've outlined, and try and see how we can leverage those to create reforms. In the area of fiscal policy, I'm trying that. I'm trying that with your own government, Pradeep, in Rajasthan. I'm facing huge resistance to the bureaucracy because it does mean a diminution in power. If you look at our direct tax reforms, they tried very hard. I was at the center of. Our major failure is with corporate tax. We have not managed to complete and finish what we started. But at least we have gone a long way. We have a much better corporate tax system now than we had earlier. We have fewer rates. We have opportunities for people to pay the taxes that the tax code suggests. And with personal income taxes, we have come a long way in the efficiency of the system and its ability to respond to change. I'm trying to persuade the state governments that some state governments, that they should do the same with the taxes they have. On a wing and a prayer, saying that this has been actually very good for the efficiency of tax collection at the central government level and very good for you. If you do these with your state level own tax revenues, you will actually be able to increase their buoyancy by simplifying them and making procedures to follow them simpler. One, if we can use taxation, which is after all a coercive instrument of the state, as an argument to reduce regulation, but with a very specific narrative for these kinds of regulations, then I think we would be in business somewhere. One area I think where we can, for the same reasons that Nitin mentioned, we can do this is environment. I'm absolutely terrified that because our environment is distorted, we will now have a regulatory beast. We already have half of it. We should very quickly dismantle that. We should make it automatic and anonymous because it is not yet a full-blown monster like labor regulation is. I think labor regulation is the biggest enemy of health and safety, occupational standards, and innovation in India. But we started regulating because the private sector was bad at doing these things, but we made it worse. We should not do that with environment. So I think less regulation in sunrise regulation areas is a very, very constructive suggestion for the government because it also takes load off government, and we have to sell it that way. कि आपके load bearing में कम करना चाहता हूँ, so that you are left free to think about grander things, and framing policy and strategy, and that's not just left to the Prime Minister's office and Niti Aayog if they're doing anything of this sort. The final suggestion I would make is that we should really, on an emergency basis, understand what to do about the rationing problem specifically in education. Because we do not educate in this country. We put people in school, college, university, etc., so that they can get credentials, which they can use to have a shot at the rationing system. This has not been upended by the new education policy. This has not been upended in any state. Where it has been upended, such as Kerala, what we have essentially seen is exports of that resource and very little benefit to Kerala. And therefore, we do not have a strategic take on how and what we need to do such that education investments going forward improve our competitiveness by making competitiveness, in a sense, more inclusive, by permitting people to participate in making competitiveness more inclusive. I don't know if I'm making sense, but not treating students as factors of production. Now, that is antithetical to the spirit of parents in this country, many parents. It is antithetical to the way we look at our universities. It has become so, especially going forward, as we have become more mass market. And we do need to have a social movement, which I think we should foster. This has nothing to do with government. If you go to government and say, provide education, they will provide you with this technocratic mess we have. They will respond to the incentives they see. So this has to be done by society. And until we do that, frankly, I do not see how, for the reason Shailesh mentioned, we are not China, how we are going to incrementally and transformationally become more and more competitive such that reversals do not happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratan. Thank you very much. With that, we go to the last speaker and the most unbiased among any of us, because he only got into action much after the 91 reforms took place. Abhishek Kumar, my very dear colleague who does a lot of think work for us. Some of you might have seen his work that he's done in terms of the debate that we ran on Plan 21. Abhishek, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mehta, and hello to everybody. Some of us have already met, some of us have not, but a great hello to all of you. I think this conversation has already touched upon some broader issues and some semantics. I would like to start with some of the broader issues, specifically starting from a point that has been troubling me for quite some time, which is when we speak about the economic projections, 5 trillion, 4 trillion, 3 trillion, what is the basis of arriving at that figure? I have not been able to find anywhere anybody has said this is how we've arrived at 5 trillion economy. So the essential problem is that problem starts to get manifested at that very level because you are trying to chase something without having understood how we are going to do it. So there is absolutely no clarity on that. Whether it is on sectoral analysis, demand supply assessment, composition of GDP, what is the basis? And I say this specifically because of this. Look at in 2014, when India was, I think, about 1.7 trillion economy. In 2019, we were about 2.7 trillion economy, having added only $1 trillion in the 5 years. And in the next few years, we want to double that up. So it's really, really unfathomable for me to understand how these figures really are put out. But be that as it may, so the fundamental issue remains that. And it is an important issue. Why? Because the four things that you've spoken about in your brief also, competition policy, investment promotion, firm competitiveness, and role of public institutions, all depend on that. And they all depend on that is because without a plan, without a strategy, we are not ever going to be able to attain 5 trillion or 4 trillion or 3 trillion economy. So ideally, for me, this conversation or any such conversation would have made better sense if it was about an existing plan, an existing strategy, and how we as civil society, we as different experts can help government hone that better. So, but anyway, but this remains an endemic problem. But despite that, I would like to see some order in those four attributes and the four aspects that I just spoke about. Because the least that we can do is to try and see things in a proper structure in order to arrive at that whatever figure that we have in our mind when we talk about this is where we want to reach. So, for example, start with firms. You're speaking about competitiveness, start with firms. Now, the first question that comes to my mind, and I've learned a great deal from all of your readings and Ratan's work on how to look at Indian economy, Mr. Desai's work on labor and employment and wages, and many of you have spoken about it in the past, plus the kind of work that we managed to do at CUTS, going down to the ground, looking at sectors, opening those sectors specifically at every cluster, at every zone. I think it's something that gave us that empirical background to base my arguments on. So starting with firms. So what is it that we make in an economy, and at what cost, and for whom, and by employing whom? I don't think we are asking these questions at all. And in that sense, I think when somebody said that what sectors we should focus on becomes a very, very important question. These questions are also important because unless you understand these questions very well and you understand the answers of these questions very well, you will not be able to determine where and how and at what cost can we be competitive. And at CUTS, we've done that. We went to different sectors for a deeper understanding of the entire value chain, opened up each node of that value chain, and tried to understand that what are the factors that are limiting the competitiveness of those nodes in those particular locations. And not just that, but also to assess, because we are also living in digital world, also to assess the play of digital on all of these specific nodes. In some areas, they create a lot of efficiencies. In the other areas, they take out a lot of factors of production, for example, labor. So I think these are the important questions. I'll give you two examples why we need to look at this kind of a framework. In my own work with CUTS colleagues on textile sector, we are clearly seeing, I mean, textile sector gets a lot of sobs because they say 45 million people depend on textile, second only to agriculture. So yes, it has a lot of employment, this thing, and hence should be treated in a certain way. But when we go down, and this is across the country, and what you're going to see is that the entire textile part of it, I'm not talking about the apparel part of it, you are increasingly seeing automation come in. You are increasingly seeing the remaining skills that are left on that automated floor to be becoming lesser and lesser human-centric. So even the people who are employed over there eventually will be out of job without having to acquire any skill which can possibly use for something else. And that worries me because there is a demand supply gap vis-a-vis labor on that front. You have so many people who are looking for jobs. You have so few requirements to absorb these kind of people. So that is why I say that if textile is to be automated eventually, then why are we spending so much energy in textile? Could we not focus India as a garment capital of the world? Because you have two advantages over there. We have export-oriented units, and we also have a very, very domestic demand. Perhaps, but we're not able to actually cater to that domestic demand because the different factors of production, and not just one factor of production, in different states act differently on the competitiveness of an industry. Rajasthan, for example. Rajasthan has the lowest electricity unit cost when it comes out of generation. And when it goes to all the way to Discom, it becomes most uncompetitive with respect to some of the comparable states. My colleague Sarthak Shukla had done a fantastic analysis of how Rajasthan loses just because of the inefficiencies in the power distribution system. So I think one of the ways to look at competitiveness is to actually break it down into smaller problems at a very decentralized level, and that requires hard work. That requires focus, that requires hard work, that requires coordination between states and center, that requires Commerce Ministry to be very, very agile, that requires a hell lot of things. So the conversation that we are having, ideally, in my mind, should be upon what are those components where we require that additional push so that we are not dependent on the existing state capacity, which is already pretty low. Now, come back to basics then. So the point I'm really making is that there's need to also understand the knowledge systems within a firm. And linking it with the point that Ratin also mentioned, education, fantastic education, but why is there so much of a education employment gap is because we're trying to structure education without understanding the needs of employment. So go and study the factory floor, see what are the knowledge systems within a factory floor. Are there capabilities enhancement programs within the factory floor? And if not, then we need to think about our education system in a completely different way. So we need to sort of look at the proposition the other way around. Knowledge systems in our productive industries, and how do they relate to things like education and others.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add one last point to that. Role of public institution, I think that is very critical, and something I've had the opportunity to work with Mr. Mehta on that, is oftentimes we also take out judicial systems outside the purview of the role of public institutions. We're focusing too much on regulation, but we're not really looking at perhaps the harm that's done because of lack of judicial coherence between high courts and supreme courts and between different benches of the court. So I'll end my initial remarks over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. The point which you made was raised by Shailesh in his remarks about the issue about contract enforcement and the judicial ecosystem, which again is very important aspect of of the whole industrial ecosystem that we are talking about in terms of raising competitiveness. We have some very eminent panelists with us in the audience who will be speaking at a future session as well. I just recognized. Let me recognize them: Monte Ahluwalia. And I can't see all of them somehow, but may I now, before we conclude, let me go back to the two catalysts, Preetam Banerjee and Amit Kapoor, and whatever else others may have to speak about, if they can take 2 to 3 minutes. We have about 15 minutes left for this event. So, Preetam, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. I think, largely speaking, we saw the basic theme come back to the concept of implementation at the ground level, or what I was calling plumbing, and the word that you liked as well. And there, once again, to go back to that point about that Indira ji made, that a lot of our officers are, doing firefighting, right? I mean, why is the case? It's because you have capacity down below, which is lacking. Again, to the whole point about city governance, again, city, municipality, all of those are again ground level administrative units. But let's extend that whole concept of institutions beyond government. You have, business associations, you have university administrations. When we look at the gamut of issues we are discussing, the people responsible for delivery is just not the government. There are several other private quasi-public institutions involved, and we need to think about their capacity development as well. I'll just take one illustrative example. It's somewhat unpopular to say this aloud, but if you look at our central government, if you look across our main ministries, what has typically happened is a lot of consulting firms come in to, supposedly, implement certain projects. What actually happens is that they're providing you with human resources to a top level bureaucracy to do a lot of the day-to-day stuff. I mean, some of them are even answering parliament questions. What does that tell me? It tells me that you have a top layer, and right below the top layer, which is supposed to do a lot of the other things, is not being able to deliver. So your top layer is completely dependent on this other set of resources they get in from wherever else. This was, and I am somewhat in generationally somewhat in between, being in my early 40s, between the people who probably saw most of their lives in the pre-liberalization, and then those who were completely in the liberalization. I saw kind of a little bit of both. So what I remember, large members of my family were in government services, were at different levels. And what I remember was that this wasn't the case in the 70s and 80s. And I stand to be corrected by those who know better. But I think it's one aspect we have gotten worse of. I think it perhaps relates to the problem that Mr. Rathin Roy was mentioning, that the problems were much smaller. It was all about rational, this rationing issue that was there to deal with. Now we have a bigger set of challenges to deal with, and that's not probably something the system can address. But it boils down to that entire point about finding out where, at which points the institutional gaps exist and how we can plug them. And it's going to take years to do this. And it's not one day, and it's not next year. And my last final point, therefore, is that this is not something that is very sexy. It does not, adhere to the election cycle, the news cycle. So how do we get out of that problem? Because I think somewhere today as a society, we are stuck. Even the top level management and the middle level management, the incentives are to meet the election cycle or the news cycle. To make that transition, I think we need to have a lot of learning, a lot of things we need to understand how we make that transition. And I hope this effort that we are doing now brings up ideas to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Preetham. Surely Rome was not built in a day. And at Kutch, we have found in the last 36 years of our work is to keep the narrative alive. It's only when the narrative dies down that people don't understand the need to do that. Neither we are expecting it to be a magic wand that we will see, an excellent result the next day in the basis of the kind of all these issues which have come up, the problems in the system which comes up. And of course, many of the questions are very micro questions as well, which are coming up. And what we are trying to focus to tell the audience as well as the panel is, can we target our attention to implementation as such, on how do we build competitiveness? What are the main blocks behind that? I'm sure the whole ecosystem of governance, etc., would come up when we talk in terms of many of these issues which have an indirect relation, if not a direct relation. Amit bhai?
Yes, sir.
Are you there? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Hi, Pradeep ji. Just a couple of quick points, actually, like we are pulling up from whatever was said. I think what you said, like there is this whole issue of regulatory cholesterol. But now the question is, how do we build trust? Because trust is an element which has a huge impact on the competitiveness of the country. In fact, when we talk about issues of, say, clusters as well, I think there is severe lack of trust that actually exists between firms itself to share knowledge, share information and things. And how we really talk about building up of clusters in the country is hugely, it's a very narrow way of looking at, or shallow way of looking at it. We have to really look at a much more broad-based thing. The second thing was about what Rathan had actually said, and I think that was a very important point. If I got the word right, aspirational schizophrenia. So, like that's a very important point. And in fact, we might laugh at it, but the question is, what is it that we want to be as a country? What is that vision that we actually have? Do we have that written on paper? Is the vision that we want to be a $5 trillion economy, or the vision is that we have to talk about quality of life or for our people, which is going to be fulfilling and so on and so forth. So that's a very important point that we have to look at. The next thing is that I agree with Shailesh as well, but then the question is that if you really look at how do we define, how do we really look at the say what you call as the Bimaru states or whatever, they continue to be at the low end of the growth story and things. If we are able to solve those states, there are a lot of things would actually get solved. In fact, there is a huge north-south divide that actually exists in terms of performance and things like UP might want to do it. It has the antecedents, but now the question is, does it have the institutions to really go ahead and do it? I think there is a very favorite thing that we all do, that it is about that saying that bureaucracy is not done right or whatever. But now the question is that I think there is also severe lack of talent within the bureaucracy. There seems to be a talent gap that actually exists. Like we need far more people or whatever. The governmental machinery has not been able to really take things forward or extract work out of those things. So how do we look at it? But last but not the least, like my recent book, which was published by Bertelsmann, and I've talked about elections and how elections are actually won. We looked at the last 50 years of data. What I find is that elections today are being won on the basis of if you are able to actually give support to the poor, or what you would call as dole that we are able to give. So if that is the way that people are going to win elections, there might actually be a huge level of dissonance that actually exists between economic objectives and social objectives. So we need to actually delineate that. But last but not the least, I think there is also a thing from a governance point of view. I think as we look at it, we need to find a way that people who have worked in the civil services, they should not be allowed to go into the government for at least some period. They cannot immediately, uh, put down, or they retire from the IAS and become ministers. There has to be something there that happens, because otherwise what we are really talking about a huge issue of inbreeding that needs to stop, because that can actually have a huge bearing on how the country operates and works, and can have detrimental effect on institutions and the democratic processes. So some of these points which I thought I'll share that I...
Thank you, Amit. See, this issue about trust, and one issue which we I don't know why we are so scared to speak about, is the corruption, which is actually one of the basic drivers of the regulatory cholesterol. And people want to make money out of the discretionary, and therefore they continue to make ambiguous laws or ambiguous regulations or even ambiguous practices in order to ensure that this happens. And this is something which we've seen on many occasions. Having said that, let me now request Jagat for his own remarks for about 1 to 2 minutes. Jagat, are you there? Hello? Well, if he's gone, may I now turn to Nitin?
What for? My only remark is that corruption probably lightens the load of regulation. So,
that's an easy way to look at it.
Value. At least in China, look at China.
Yeah.
Far more corrupt country than India is, but it's doing very merrily. So don't, and not that this one would recommend this as a policy, but just wanted to accept it.
Nena?
I just like to make the one point, and that is, I don't think it's about numbers in the bureaucracy. I think we are in a very specialized world today, and there isn't enough specialization in the bureaucracy. I think it's time we recognize that expertise. And I actually, Preetham, do think that there's need for the consultants, because they bring the expertise that otherwise bureaucracy lacks. And we have seen that some of the work that came out of EESL, for example, was a very small team, but their outreach was so good. And Nitin will support this, because you remember at Shakti Sustainable Foundation, we helped with a lot of grunt work there. But a good officer in charge who understands what he needs, that bandwidth from outside and the expertise, can actually go a long way. It's just the way the two work that would be important to determine the future.
Thank you. Shailesh?
Yeah, to begin with, this is why I keep this always on my chair, because this is the guy who actually stands and does things on the ground. So I need to remind all our company people that implementation is where it is at. And, Rakesh Jhunjhunwala made a recent comment. He's a stock market investor. He said that Indians outside in, let's say, the US get a platform. And over the next 10 years, we are going to enable Indians to have that platform within India and look at them go. So I probably would say that, the point about the rational economy that Ratin made is going to be dismantled brick by brick, not at the union government level, but at the state government level and the city government level. So if at all there has to be a focus, I would strongly urge a focus on states and city governments. And the way union governments have actually, done one thing in the last 10 years, and which is to enable mobile phones to access most government services. Can we do the similar kind of platform creation using mobile phones at the state and city government levels? Last point on the bureaucracy. I have spent 17 years in the IAS, and let me just say this. Um, I've seen both pre-liberalization 1986 to 90 capital markets and the kind of transformation that has happened there. Today's bureaucracy is far more technically proficient than 20 years ago. I mean, just analyze the secretaries in government of India today. How many IITians and MBAs are there? Which was never the case 20 years ago. My last request to this August gathering, great collection of smart minds, is we spend too much time talking in English to our IAS colleagues and friends in the union government, not in the central government. The sooner we stop calling it the central government, the sooner we'll get it into our head that states and cities matter. We should actually spend much more time talking to a Nagar Nigam commissioner and the commissioner's team to understand where, I really like Preetham's point about institutional capacity, strength, and credibility. So if cuts can drive this point home, stop bothering about government of India. That's like the European Commission. Let's focus on the government of Portugal, the government of Spain, and the city of Madrid. Maybe that's the way to go. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That was famously called pigs.
I quickly ask Shailesh, how many of you know who is the mayor of Bombay and who is the mayor of Delhi?
I do, because this is a bit of a passion, but most people would not.
How many people know the mayor of Bombay or the mayor of Delhi? They're powerless people. They're totally powerless in our system.
There are three municipal corporations in Delhi, am I right?
Oh, that was deliberately done so that Sheila Dikshit doesn't get called the mayor.
I think it's very silly. Bombay and Calcutta, two huge municipal corporations, have one mayor. In Jaipur, they have now split it into two. Jaipur, Jodhpur, and others. I can't understand why, for whatever political
The
reasons.
thing is the politician land mafia not wanting to lose control on the enormous illegal profits which can be made through urbanization. This is the reality.
By the way, Shailesh,
from the land market, nothing will happen.
Shailesh, the word central government does not exist in the Constitution of India.
Well, it is not the central public
What
service.
I'm saying is, it is
the UPSC. Yeah.
Throughout the Constitution of India, it only talks about union government.
So I wish I got $1 for every time someone mentions central government. I'd be a millionaire.
Indira, for your last remarks.
Thank you. I've heard all the previous speakers and I have reactions to all of them, but I don't have the time to express myself on those. But let me reiterate what I was saying earlier. I totally agree with you that the Constitution refers to the union of states and the union government, but popularly it's called the central government, and appropriately, because it is terribly important. The problem is that the idea of a federal structure has permeated only the political sphere, and beyond appointing finance commissions and sending statutory flows to the states, which have been terribly important, there has not been a formal channel of communication between central ministries and state and district level departments which work in that area. So I want to re-emphasize this with all the power at my command, that unless we do that in the sphere of competitiveness and get a two-way information flow, we are not going to be able to carry this country forward, because it is far too large to be managed by a central bureaucracy. I've written a paper recently on how our reaction to COVID was severely obstructed by the fact that the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare at the center was not listening to what was happening in the outer reaches of the country, including in Kerala, which started off very well, but was completely defeated by the Vande Bharat flights, which brought home infected immigrants from the Gulf and elsewhere. it is extremely important for us to realize that what have been encrusted as family as central programs like midday meals and the employment guarantee scheme were all schemes which started in states. There was an employment guarantee scheme in Maharashtra in the 1970s, which was the progenitor of the national scheme. There was a midday meal scheme started in Tamil Nadu by M.G. Ramachandran, for which he is revered in that state, which then became a national scheme. So this process of feedback from what's happening in the periphery has happened, but it has not been formalized. So I think unless we formalize this, we're not going to get anywhere. And let me just very, very quickly say that example I gave of the outgrowth of a weed-based yarn in Tamil Nadu. This calls for cooperation across agriculture and industry, because this milkweed is something that grows rampantly on dry areas in Tamil Nadu. And Tamil Nadu is actually a very dry state. Traditionally, farmers would weed out that milkweed and throw it away because it was standing in the way of the small crop of whatever they were trying to grow in a rain-fed way. So this calls for cooperation across sectors between industry and agriculture, and that can only be facilitated if there is a federal structuring to government at the center. Stop here.
Thank you very much. On that point, Indira, we would request all panelists, as well as anybody in the audience, to email us any of their views, because as I said, this is a colloquium. This is the first of 3 sessions, and we'll continue to upgrade the paper to the extent possible. So it's not the end of the exercise. Now turn to Ratin.
Yeah, well, I think that there's one point I did not address, which was Shailesh's very important point. And I think, yes, we know that poor judicial performance is inhibiting, competition and inhibiting many things. But why do we have poor judicial performance? It's not just a matter of having too few judges. When I look at judges, I hope there's no legal people here and this is a closed group. Some of their comments are infantile, absolutely infantile. Their judgments are infantile. Their attitude to time is infantile. And these are educated people, right? And this has been the case now for quite some time. So I really need to understand the sociology of why the judicial system is how it is. And I simply don't. That is one additional point I'd like to make. The other point I'd like to make is, while it is true that we need to go federal, I don't think our electorate agrees with us. And that is a real challenge today. I think our electorate is looking for a Jagat Guru, which is why, despite repeated demonstrations of incompetence since 2016, with apologies to Mr. Shah, parochialism within the civil service and without, leading to further incompetence, a spectacular failure to do something basic like collect taxes, demonstrable incompetence at guarding the borders, the central government in the form of a central powerful leader, it's a practical matter. I'm not casting judgments. I'm not being normative. Believe me, it sounds normative. I'm not. Is the most popular prime minister in the last 40 years. It is what people want. It is what people expect. And the fact that the central government is not able to deliver this is, I think, at the root of a very difficult political dilemma. Because if people expect the central government to deliver more than defense and railways, and the central government, therefore, will necessarily have to at least make a pretense as to tell Mr. Jaitley, आप एग्रीकल्चर के बारे में बात कीजिए, पैसे मत खर्चा कीजिए, प्लीज आपने पैसा नहीं खर्चा किया, बहुत खुश हूं, मैं कुछ नहीं बोलूंगा आपके बातों के बारे में, जो मर्जी बोलते जाइए. But you have a situation now where the government, UPA government also is forced to spend on these matters because that is what people expect of the central government. Until we solve this dilemma, we're not going to get very far, I think, with this federal project, because the incentives in the political system are not there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ratin. Now, talking about the sort of incompetence of the judiciary, you saw that last judgment by the Supreme Court in the matter of the farmers' agitation. They set up a committee comprising of 4 people who are publicly well known for their views on the Farm Bill. I mean, that is the kind of idiocy that you could see, that you should have spoken about having a balanced panel. But by the way, Arun Jaitley, speaking in the parliament, once said, the quality of judges is directly related to the liberalization which has happened. The liberalization which has happened, I'll tell you what he said. That has led to a very high demand of good lawyers to fight battles. And therefore, good lawyers refuse to go to the bench, with the result that you get average quality lawyers or mediocre lawyers going up to the bench. This is a matter of fact. This is our own empirical work that we've done to see as to analyze, as Abhishek pointed out. We've analyzed several case laws of the government of India, Supreme Court, and to see as to kind of the imbecility at often expressed, no coherence, break in the continuity and process, and so on. With that, may I come to Abhishek? Abhishek, do you have any last comments? Or let me ask.
Yeah. I think just one last comment relates to, I mean, you've repeated it many times that we need a lot of plumbing in a system, but I think plumbing for a country like India would be very, very difficult to do, precisely for the reasons that we've spoken about already, lack of state capacity in different ways. So I don't think that definitely we have plenty of laws and regulations, but I don't think we have the right kind of policy structure to take on the kind of problems that we are dealing with currently. So if we rely on a larger policy framework, which is reinformed through the experiences from the ground, then I think that will partly address the problem of state capacity. And hence, we would not have to rely so much on the government doing plumbing here and there, but working in the larger policy framework. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. May I also now request all panelists that our next session is on 17th of February. You will be getting information, and we request you to be there in order to maintain the continuity in these discussions. May I now request Bipul Chatterjee to propose a vote of thanks from Cuts. Bipul?
Thank you, Mr. Mehta. I think it was quite rich in content. I'll be very brief. First of all, let me thank all of you for the points that you have made. Each and every one of them are important, and I assure you that we are going to take them into account as we draft this white paper that Mr. Mehta has talked about in his initial remarks. And as we make progress, we are going to revise that white paper with inputs like this. So I'm not going to summarize, except just to thank all of you once again. But one or 2 points which I would like to make. First, I think we have to have a long-term vision, at least a 30-year vision for many of these changes to take place. India in 2050, centenary year of our republic. Number two, it is absolutely clear that government cannot do several things or everything that government is doing. Rather, government should not do. But that brings me to the final point, which I would like to make here today, is that we need to improve the quality of governance. And this point has come up again and again and again at all levels, union, state, and local governments. That requires a massive capacity building program. Who is going to do it? My personal opinion is that government should not do it. In that case, who is going to do it? That's something which you need to think about. So with that, on that note, let me also join Mr. Mehta in thanking you, and also to request you to join us in this series of programs which we are going to do over the next couple of months, February and March. And we're then going to come out with a white paper. How are we going to take it forward? That's something which you need to think a little bit more. But one thing which I can assure you, that it's going to be a white paper and not a colorful white paper. As things stands today, the implementation challenges that we have, that's where we are going to focus our energy. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Vipul. And with that, we come to a conclusion. Thanking all from my side, an excellent discussion.